Archiving started.
In this recording, we will be looking at the endocrine glands that are in exercise 36 of your lab manual. So you'll want to have that with you so you can see some references there for the different cells and tissues we'll be looking at in each organ. I've noticed on prior recordings that many times my voice, you'll be able to hear the voice before you can see the pictures, and you might even see some arrows and some lines being drawn before you see the first slide appear. If that's the case, just be patient because it will catch up, and if you want to, you can, on the right-hand side of your screen, go back to the first slide, and then it should pick up from there. Okay, so right now you should be able to see a sagittal view of the head, and in that you can see the pituitary gland, which is our first organ. All right, I'm putting an arrow right here on the pituitary gland. You might remember from A&P1 that the sphenoid bone has a depression in it called the sella turcica. Here you see it right here. I believe that means in Latin Turkish saddle, and the pituitary gland sits right in there. So here again you see the pituitary gland. There's a stalk called the pituitary stalk that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus of the brain. So on these next slides, we're going to be looking at the pituitary gland through the microscope. So it may take just a moment for here. When it does, you'll notice two distinct regions that in this slide, they're separated by a space. Do not worry about the space. Sometimes on the slide preparation, the two areas of the pituitary gland do get separated. But on this slide, on the right side, you can see a darker, more grainy looking tissue. That's the anterior lobe of the pituitary. You might recall from lecture, I hope you recall from lecture, that the anterior pituitary actually has secretory cells that produce various hormones, like growth hormone, prolactin. For your lab class, you do not have to know which hormones are produced by each gland. But what we're going to focus on in lab is what these look like, especially through the microscope. So again, on the right, you're seeing the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And now I'll erase these arrows. And on the left, where the arrows are pointing, you see the posterior lobe. Do you see how it looks a lot lighter? This doesn't have the secretory cells because, remember, the posterior lobe is simply an area where hormones like oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones, where those are just released, and they're just stored and then released. They're actually hormones produced by neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. All right, on the next slide, we see this same slide on a higher power magnification, and again on the right, we see the anterior lobe, and on the left, we see the posterior lobe. Now, I'd like for you to look in your lab manual, if you will. Let's see, look on page 276 under Procedure A 5C. Here it says, observe an area of the anterior lobe with high power magnification. That's what we're doing right now. So over on the right-hand side of the screen where I'm putting more arrows, all right, this one is the low power magnification. If we move up to a high power magnification, here you can see the anterior lobe, and in your lab manual, it says to notice some cells that have pink staining granules. All right, that's what you're seeing here and here. These are called acidophil cells. The dark purple that you see is the nucleus of each cell, but the pink area that your book is referring to is the cytoplasm. Okay, and it's because of the pH of the granules that makes it stain pink. Of course, it's not pink in its natural state. Well, these cells produce some of the hormones of the anterior lobe, and then the basophil cells, which have the bluer staining granules, right, because they're they're basic, therefore called basophil, they produce other hormones of the anterior lobe. Again, you don't have to know which hormones are produced by which cells or even the names of these cells or the hormones. I really just want you to be able to distinguish between the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Just like I've mentioned on some of the other slides, the still slides that you see in the exercise folder on the course site. All right, now in this next view, we're seeing a high magnification of the posterior lobe, and it's mostly just nervous tissue. So what you're seeing here, these light pink lines, these are unmyelinated neurons, and then the nuclei you see are nuclei of some neuroglial cells. Remember, neuroglial cells are support cells. These happen to be called pituocytes, so that would be a pituocyte, that would be one, that would be one. But these are types of neuroglial cells that are found in the posterior lobe. You don't have to name pituocyte. Again, you have to just distinguish between the anterior lobe of the pituitary and the posterior lobe. So on your quiz or your test, I may give you a slide that shows, like in the lower magnifications, where you see the anterior and the posterior lobe in the same field of view, and you have to know which is which. And you need to know that's the pituitary gland. All right, but if I give you a high-power magnification, such as this one, I'll probably say which lobe of the pituitary. So you'll know you're looking at pituitary, but you just need to know which lobe it is. Now, you tell me, if you're looking at the pituitary on this slide, would you be looking at the anterior lobe or the posterior lobe? Okay, if you said anterior, you're correct. And the reason is because you see distinct cells, and you see cells arranged in little clusters. I call those secretory clusters. You see that in lots and lots of glands of the body. On this next slide, now this is still from the pituitary gland, but it's another slide preparation. And again, if I said, is this anterior or posterior lobe, what would you say? If you said posterior, that's correct. It's always good for you to do an online search for other slides. That's easy to do. I hate to tell my students to do a Google search, but the Google image searches can show you lots and lots of these micrographs. So, you're not just focusing on just one picture. You can see it with different stains. You can see different slide preparations, and that's always good as you're studying these different organs. Okay, the next organ we will look at is the thyroid gland, and you can see a description of it in your lab book on page 278. I'll wait just a moment and make sure that the picture comes up for you. All right, of course, this picture is not a micrograph. This is one of the cadaver pictures from the A&P Revealed site that many of you have access to. If you purchased a new book last semester, an access code came with it for this site. So you can see lots of these cadaver pictures, which are wonderful. All right, on this one, this is in the lower neck region, and the thyroid gland is right here. I'm going to draw a line all around the thyroid. You can see there's various lobes of the thyroid, but they surround the front of the trachea just below the larynx, which is your voice box. You don't really see the larynx very well in this picture because there's some muscles overlying it, but it's in this area is the larynx. And then just below it, where I'm putting the arrows right now, this would be the thyroid gland. Okay, now as we move to another view, another slide, now we're looking at the thyroid on a low magnification. Actually, this is with scanning, I believe. And this is showing a micrograph of the thyroid gland. What you notice the most about the thyroid, or what I notice the most, are these open areas. Now, there's something inside, so it's not like adipose cells. You remember from A&P1, those look like just big empty cells because the triglycerides are dissolved out. Well, here, these are big follicles that are filled with a colloid substance where the thyroid hormones can be temporarily stored. The cells that are around the follicles produce some of the hormones, and then cells in between the follicles produce other hormones of the thyroid gland. In your lecture, you're learning about the different hormones made by the thyroid. Under the microscope, the thyroid is probably the easiest of all of the endocrine glands to identify, simply because it's the one that's got all these follicles in it. So be able to identify the thyroid follicles. Here we are on a higher magnification. You can see the follicles. In the slide preparations, many times the colloid pulls away from the edge of the follicle, so you're seeing a little space in there. Don't worry about that. Some of these follicles are large, some are small. But again, you're going to see follicles if you see thyroid. Here it is on the high power magnification. I'm sorry this one's not quite in real sharp focus for you, but you can see the semi-liquid, solid colloidal material inside a follicle. You can see the follicular cells that surround the follicle. They produce hormones like thyroxine, and then your extra follicular cells in between the follicles produce calcitonin, which affects your calcium levels in your blood. Don't worry about that for lab. That's lecture material. Just be able to identify that this is a thyroid gland, and what you see there are thyroid follicles. This next slide is also the thyroid gland, and the follicles should be very obvious to you on this slide. It's pretty much everything you see is a thyroid follicle. Our next slide, the next few slides are of the parathyroid gland. Para means beside, so this is an organ beside the thyroid. It's a tiny, tiny little organ that you have 4 of, and they sit on the posterior surface of the thyroid. This particular slide looks quite a bit like the micrograph that's in your lab manual, figures 36.4 on page 278. In this, you can see cell clusters, which this is on the scanning magnification, so it's not very high magnification, but you've got tiny little cells there. And then you also see pockets of adipose cells. On this slide, it's really easy to recognize it's parathyroid to me because of the pockets of adipose, but you don't always see that. Another thing I want you to notice on this slide, if I erase the arrows, let's point to this area and this area. Don't these areas look quite a bit like those follicles we just saw? All right, these are pieces of thyroid follicles that are attached to the parathyroid gland. So as they make these slide preparations, they have to actually remove a parathyroid from the surface of the thyroid, and many times follicles get moved too, thyroid follicles. So if you see an organ that doesn't look completely like a thyroid gland, in that it has nothing but follicles, if you see an organ that has just a few follicles attached to it, that's probably the organ, the parathyroid gland. Here it is on a higher power. You can see the follicles from the thyroid, but let's look at the parathyroid cells. All right, these cells tend to be arranged in little chains. You can write it in here. You can see the little chains of cells. That's how your book describes the cell arrangement, is in chains. Here you can see it on a higher magnification. Notice the cells are clustered in little cord-like, or I think they say cord-like patterns. So you especially can see that right here, like little cords or ropes. I like this slide. This is one we use here on campus. It's very, very faint, and so it's really not a great slide preparation, but I do like it because you can see the parathyroid gland, which I'm going to encircle. There you see it. Sorry. All right, there's your parathyroid gland. But then you also can see some little follicles attached to it. So these follicles are actually thyroid follicles that got pulled off the thyroid gland when they were preparing this slide for parathyroid. Okay, if we look at it on a higher view, on this next slide, you can see the follicles on the right, and then all of the big strip on the left will be the parathyroid gland. And here it is on a higher view. I'm going to put some arrows on the cord-like arrangement of the parathyroid cells. You can see that. You see a little bit of the cord-like arrangement. And then over here to the right, there's a thyroid follicle. There's one. There's one. So on a lab test or a quiz, I might have a picture like this one where you're seeing some thyroid follicles, but I may ask you, what's this on the left here? or I may put it at the top or the bottom. You don't memorize left and right, of course, but you get the idea. If you see a glandular-looking organ, glandular meaning it's got the clusters of cells, and you see follicles attached to it, then that organ that follicles are attached to would be the parathyroid. If I asked you the organ that the follicles are a part of, that would be the thyroid. All right, the next few slides will be showing the pancreas. Here we're seeing just the abdominal wall. This is from your AMP Revealed website that you can get to with your access code. I've got several of these pictures in the lecture notes. If you are in the lecture class, you've been seeing these. I'll try to put some more in the lab because they are interesting. Here, if you remove the skin and the muscle just underneath it, those sheets of muscle over your abdomen, what we're seeing is there's the liver, there's the gallbladder, here's portions of the stomach, and then this fatty material that you're seeing is like an apron that drapes from the stomach over the intestines. It's called the greater omentum. We'll discuss that when we get to the digestive system. On the next slide, the greater omentum has been removed. So underneath it, now you're seeing the small intestine. All right, if we remove all of the intestine and the stomach, here's the stomach right here. On the next slide, and we removed also that gallbladder and portions of the liver. But now you can see the pancreas. You might have wondered where we're going with that. But now you see the pancreas. And I'll draw a line around the pancreas. So it's somewhat of a feather-shaped organ. The pancreas is an interesting organ because not only is it an endocrine gland producing hormones, but it also is an organ that produces a juice, pancreatic juice, that empties into ducts. And then if I was just to draw in a duct, let's draw in a big pancreatic duct, that duct empties into the small intestine. So this organ right here, this is the very first part of your small intestine. Pancreatic juice empties into that to aid with digestion. But in this lab exercise, we're going to look at the pancreas as an endocrine gland, not exocrine. All right, and so we've got to look at it through the microscope. And here you're seeing, if I outline, this is the big pancreatic duct. All right, that's a duct. All right, and then you're seeing lots of these little lobes or lobules of the pancreas. There's one. There's a lobule of the pancreas. All right, there's several lobules, and they're separated from each other. You see the little spacing around them. Well, within each lobule, you've got two groups of cells. All right, one group, which is by far the most numerous group. That's what you're seeing in all this dark pink areas. All right, these clusters of cells are producing the pancreatic juice, which moves into little ducts like this one that lead into the big pancreatic duct. All right. However, like I said, we're studying this as an endocrine organ, and so I want you to notice in several of these lobes, you also see some clusters that, to me, I just like to describe them as they're lighter staining. They just look different. Some of them are big, like this one up here on the top right, that I've got two arrows on. Some look tiny, like this one in the center at the top. But these are the endocrine areas. They're called the islets of Langerhans, or pancreatic islets. If we look at this slide more closely on a higher view, again down at the bottom here, this is the pancreatic duct. But if we look at one of the lobes, let me circle the lobe I want you to look at. Let's look at this one. Okay, in this lobe, right here where I've got the arrows, all right, that is an islet of Langerhans. If I encircled that islet, it would be right there. Okay, so that's the endocrine area. You may see lots of these. In these little lobes, you may see just a few. It's got to be sectioned right in order for you to be able to see them. You see lots of areas other than the little exocrine secreting areas. Most of what you're seeing are these exocrine areas. like here and here and here. All of this darker pink where the cells are staining dark. Those are exocrine areas. We want to look for the light areas. You see some other light areas. For example, on the far top left of the screen, look at this light area. All right, this is not an islet of Langerhans. I'm seeing there a blood vessel and a smaller duct that would then empty into the larger pancreatic duct. So you're not going to look for anything with distinct holes in it. That would not be a pancreatic islet because these endocrine areas don't have ducts. They have blood vessels, but they're tiny little capillaries, which are not going to look big and open like you see up here on the top left. All right, instead, if you will look, let's see if we can find some more pancreatic islets. There's one. We'll circle this one. On this view, that's about the only one I see. This possibly is one. We'd have to look at that on a higher view. I might be seeing red blood cells inside of that, so that would be a blood vessel. Let's look on another view. We move to another slide. Here it is on even higher power, and I'll circle. See if you can find an islet of Langerhans there. There's one. Now I'll draw a circle around it. Here we go. That's it just looks a little bit different than the other clusters. These other areas, I'll draw circles around. These are the exocrine clusters. You don't have to name them. We'll study them when we get to the digestive system in lecture. All right, but all those dark little clusters are the exocrine areas. The large cluster that I'll circle in green, this large cluster, that's the pancreatic islet, okay? Which I know on this view doesn't stand out as much as on some views. All right, here you see in another slide preparation of the pancreas, and on this one, the pancreatic islet or islet of Langerhans is very, very apparent. That's the large cluster that you see that whose cells stain a little bit lighter. This one right here. That's the pancreatic islet. Okay. All right, all these other little clusters, those are the digestive enzyme secreting clusters of cells. So those would be exocrine. Okay, now we're ready to look at our last organ, which is the adrenal gland. I'll wait just a moment, make sure the slide comes up for you. All right, on this picture, what you're seeing is the kidney. All right, so here's the kidney. And sitting on top of the kidney is this organ called the adrenal gland. So all of this that I'm circling in red, that's the adrenal gland. Okay? It's like a cap on top of the kidneys. It really doesn't have anything to do functionally with the kidneys. It just is on that location right there on top of the kidneys. On a higher view, here you can see the kidney sectioned. You also can see the adrenal gland sectioned. And you see with this adrenal gland, there's a good bit of fat on the surface of it. So all of this light area, that's some fat and part of the capsule. But the adrenal gland itself has two distinct areas. This little outer rim of it, do you see right here? All right, this area is called the adrenal cortex. So it forms, you can see it all the way around it. And then the inner part right here is the adrenal medulla. Okay, so actually the medulla, let me redo that. The medulla is just this very central part right here. The cortex has some distinct regions. So right there, all of that would be cortex. Okay, on our next slide, here we're seeing on a micrograph. Of course, that's a picture taken with the microscope. And I've seen some slides that are better than this one. I've seen some that are not quite as distinct as this one is. But you can see overall that there's two general areas on this slide. All right, at the outer surface, this would be the capsule, there and there. Here we're not seeing the whole adrenal gland, of course. And then the cortex would be this region. from here to here. And then on the other side, all of this would be cortex. If you look at the cortex very carefully, it's hard to see on this scanning magnification, but in the cortex, the cells are somewhat lined up. So that's why sometimes on some drawings, you see stripes in the cortex, like I'm trying to draw here. You'll see stripes. That gives you an indication of the way the cells are arranged. They're arranged in columns. All right, if I erase that, and then look at this center area, this is the medulla. And the cells arrangements are very different in the medulla. They're more in clusters. If we look at this on a higher view, all right, look at the bottom left corner. Do you see how in this area the cells tend to be somewhat lined up? Okay, look for that here. Oh, you can see it really well right there. See how they're lined up? I realize you have to look for this. It's not something that's just going to pop out at you. But we would be in the cortex here. And then in this area at the top of the slide, top right of the slide, that would be the medulla. Right? On a lab test for the adrenal gland slides, I'll make sure that you can see the cortex and the medulla in the same field of view. So look for, like on this slide, what would this area be right here? This is a higher magnification now. That would be the medulla. And then the cortex would be up here. You can see how the cells are somewhat lined up. Okay, so that would be cortex. And then here's another slide preparation of the adrenal gland. And in this one, at the bottom of the slide, you can see some areas that are highlighted in blue. Do you think that's the cortex or is that the medulla? If you said the adrenal and medulla, you're correct. Because in the cortex, you can see how these cells, even though this is a very low magnification, you can still see how these cells are lined up. All right, again, I really, really, really encourage you to do some image searches. Just go to Google or Yahoo or MSN and do a search and click on do image search. I'm sure many of you have done that. And then key in, you could do endocrine micrographs, or even be more specific and put pituitary micrographs or pituitary slide, pituitary microscope pictures. There are lots of things you can key in that will pull up a variety of images. Sometimes it'll pull up a link to a website from another college where they've got a lot of their slides out there for you. So I encourage you to do that. All right, that's all. Make sure that you can distinguish the specific regions for each of the slides that I've indicated in the folder on course content for exercise 36.
Archive recording has